Golden State Media Concepts bring you Book Review Podcast, a haven for bookworms of all ages and the widest genres, from mystery to memoirs, romance to comedy, fantasy to sci-fi. If you love to read, this is a podcast for you. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Sarah. It's Tuesday, so you know what that means. It means I have another wonderful author to come and talk to you about not only a book this time, but the fifth book in a series. So, you know, I always say if you like to have multiple books in a series that you can read all at once, then this is an interview for you. This is historical fiction, as I mentioned at the end of the last episode. So you have 5 books that are out that you can read. Before we get to that, though, how are you doing? How was your weekend? How is your week going so far? It's really hazy here today, which is not, it's not overcast in terms of like clouds. We get sand and dust from the Sahara Desert that comes and makes it overcast here where I live sometimes, which is very, very strange. I've gotten a little bit more used to it, but still, when we first moved here in the first month or so, we had what I called apocalypse skies. It was the creepiest color I'd ever seen, and it was just sand from the Sahara Desert. I was not expecting that, but hey, that's why you live in different places, right? So you can learn interesting facts like that. Our weekend. What did we do this weekend? Did we do anything this weekend? It was very quiet. I know that. You know what? We worked a lot this weekend. That's why I'm not remembering what we did. It was a fine weekend. We got a lot done. So that was good. But yeah, that's why I can't remember what day of the week it is either. I talked to my mom on Sunday, and even conversations with my husband, he kept saying things on Sunday that I knew he was thinking it was a weekday, and I kept saying, yes, but it's Sunday, and he kept going, oh, wow, that's right. So yeah, I'm very confused about the day of the week, but that's okay. I do remember it's Tuesday, so that's one step in the right direction. We have more company coming in starting tomorrow. I'm looking forward to that. But otherwise, just life as usual. So let's talk about books and authors. Today's author is Mark Ellis. As I mentioned, historical fiction. This is the DCI Frank Merlin series. It is about police investigations in World War II. Something that you don't often think about. You know, when we think about, we've had a lot of World War II books and authors on the podcast, and often, you know, we're talking about different aspects of the war, of course. And of course, this involves the war and different things that are going on in the war, but home life during wars is always something that's fascinating to me as well. And the fact that there was an uptick in crime in England during World War II, which we talk about this a little bit in the interview, does make sense when you think about it, but you don't often think about just those daily things continuing to go on, right? Like investigating theft or a murder or those sorts of things. There's so many bigger issues happening during a world war that we often maybe forget that their day-to-day life and day-to-day crime went on. So that's what this series centers on, although in a larger, broader context. It is, as I said, the 5th book in the series. It is called Dead in the Water. Let me give you the description of Dead in the Water. It is the summer of 1942, the summer of 1942. The World War rages on, but Britain now faces the Nazi threat with America at its side. In a bombed-out London swarming with gangsters and spies, DCI Frank Merlin continues his battle against rampant wartime crime. A mangled body is found in the Thames just as some items of priceless art go mysteriously missing. What sinister connection links the two? Merlin and his team follow a twisting trail of secrets and lies as they investigate a baffling and deadly puzzle. So Mark's going to talk about this a little bit, but there's a lot of different layers in this story and in all of his stories. He says, so there's a whole bunch of threads that have to be brought together that maybe at first they feel like, are they connected? Are they not connected? How are we going to tie this all together? So you have, there's an element of art theft in this story, and that's tied in with the Nazis and, the way they just stole a lot of art and a lot of priceless artifacts from many Jewish families during the war. So that's part of it. There is a murder. There's just a lot of different elements. You're going to learn a lot of different things, a lot of different pieces of history from this time period. Some of it's set in Lisbon. There's a character who's based in Lisbon. Frank's family is half Spanish, so there's some references to the Spanish Civil War that happened before World War II. You get a lot of pieces, which I really like. It's definitely a tapestry throughout this story. So let's go ahead and turn now to the interview with Frank. Frank. That's the character. Let's turn to the interview with Mark. If I'm interviewing the character, that's a completely different podcast. Let's interview the author instead. So Mark Ellis, and the book is Dead in the Water. Hi, Mark. Welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Sarah. It's a delight and a pleasure.
Thank you for being here. I'm excited to talk about your new book. It's not a new series, but it's a new book in that series. But before we talk about the book and the series, if you wouldn't mind just sharing a little bit about yourself so my listeners can get to know you a bit.
Sure. I'm originally from Wales, where I grew up. I had a career, a varied career, in that I was a barrister, I was a banker, I went into corporate life, and then I ended up starting up my own computer services business with a partner, which then took up quite a big chunk of my life. I'd always wanted to write, and but never had the time. But when we sold the computer services company, I thought, this is my opportunity, and if I'm going to ever do this, I better do it now. So I started writing what became the Frank Merlin series, which is a story about a World War II detective based in Scotland Yard in London, and of which I have so far written 5 books, and there are more to come. And basically, I'm taking him through the war. The first book starts in 1940, and my aim is to take him right the way through to the end of the war. So far, we've got up to 1942 with this new book, Dead in the Water, and the book I'm currently working on, which we can talk about a bit later, is set in 1943. So I've had experienced a lot of different things. When I was in business, I lived in America. I lived in New York for a couple of years and spent quite a lot of time in California, which I thoroughly enjoyed. But now my life is a little bit different. I don't get to meet an awful lot of people because I'm sitting down every day to write my books.
Yeah, it's a little less social than being in other kinds of business.
It is, of course. When you get to publish the book, you meet quite a few people that way.
Yes.
And so far, with this book, I've not only been doing functions in the UK, but I actually did come over to America a few weeks ago and did some stuff on the East Coast. Unfortunately, I didn't get to the West Coast. But the highlight, I think, was probably being in the Mysterious Bookshop in New York, which I've been to before. And we had a decent crowd there to hear about my books.
Wonderful. Well, Wales is definitely on our list of places to explore while we're living in Europe. So I might have to pick your brain off air about where we should go.
Well, I come from Swansea, and Swansea is most famous for being the home of Dylan Thomas.
Yes.
And there are a few other writers who come from there. Not many people know this because he's really regarded as English, but Martin Amis, who sadly died the other day, was born in Swansea. So
okay.
I feature on a list of Swansea writers just below Martin Amis. So that's quite nice.
I love it. Thank you. Well, this, you previewed nicely some of the questions that I have for you today. So that was a good intro. But you mentioned that this is a series. It's a series about DCI Frank Merlin during World War II. Can you talk about what made you decide to write this series and set it during World War II?
Yes, of course. I do like historical fiction, and I do like crime. So I wanted to have a bit of both. And And there were various different historical periods I considered. I'm very keen on the 18th century, and I thought about having a character set then. But ultimately, I came down on World War II, partly influenced, I think, by my parents. Sadly, my parents are no longer with us, but when I was growing up, my father died when I was quite young, when I was 7, and he died quite a long time after the war in 1960, but he died because he contracted a disease in the war, serving in Africa, a wasting disease. So in that sense, World War II loomed quite large in my life when I was growing up. And then my mother, who had been a teenager during the war and had been working for the railways in Wales, also used to tell me interesting stories. Swansea got heavily bombed during the war because it was a major port. And she used to tell me stories of seeing, from a distance, seeing the bombs falling on Swansea. And then later in the war, because she worked for the railway, she got free tickets every so often to go to London and would go up to London. This is later in the war now than the Blitz, but it's 1944, which is the time of the Doodlebugs, the V-2 bombers. And I would say, well, why would you go up to London if it was being bombed? And she said, well, we had to live our lives and live our lives as normally as possible. So then I became intrigued by the concept of what was life on the home front like. And of course, when I researched this more, obviously life went on. People fell in love, people fell out of love, people got divorced, got married, had children, killed each other, strangled each other, stole from each other, and so on. So I just thought, wouldn't it be interesting to write about that in the context of a criminal book? And then when I did some further research, I discovered that, contrary to what I thought and what many people think, there was a crime boom during the war. Recorded crime grew by 60% in the years between 1939 and 1945 in England. And when you think about it, it's not so difficult to understand. You had a blackout. There were lots of rationing, which meant that people would be forging ration books and so on. I mean, there were huge new amounts or new opportunities for crime. And I thought, well, goodness, this will be a good place to put a policeman. I mean, a lot of people tend to think of the war with sort of rosy eyes, in the sense that criminals might have taken it easy during the war to help the war effort, like everyone else was working on the war effort, but that was not true. Criminals had a great time during World War II. So I've got Frank Merlin, who came originally, he was more of a straightforward Cockney, but he's actually half Spanish, half English. He's the son of a Spanish merchant seaman who fell in love with an English Cockney girl. Obviously, in terms of his language, he's not speaking Spanish much, although when he swears, he swears in Spanish occasionally. And he has Latin dark good looks. So that's where he is. And he's in his early 40s in the war when the book starts. And he's a widower. His wife has died shortly before the war. And so I got criticized the other day for going too far into detail about what his personal life develops as in the books. So I won't say anything more than his life gets a bit happier on the personal front.
It is time for our first break of this episode, now that you've been introduced to Mark and to the series. When we come back, Mark's going to talk a little bit more about the first, actually 6 books in the series, give you a little bit of an overview of all of those books so you can have an idea of the series. And, of course, if you want to go back to the beginning and start with book 1, this will give you a good overview. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I'll be right back.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast. I am interviewing author Mark Ellis. We are talking about his DCI Frank Merlin series, specifically the 5th book, Dead in the Water. Let's go ahead and return to that interview. Yes, and this is the 5th book that we're going to talk about today. So I haven't read the rest of the series. You can read them as standalones, although, you can tell if it's a series. That always makes me want to go back to the beginning and find out.
You can. I write them in such a way as they can be read on a completely standalone basis. Obviously, I meet some readers. I've got a British historian who's just taken up my books and read them all in a go, and he says fervently, please read the beginning to the end. But I've got lots of other people who've read it the other way around and are perfectly happy with having done that. So the first book, there is a slight complication as I discuss the books, in the sense that recently my publishers, Hachette, decided to produce all the books in new covers, which is all very nice. But they also decided that they would have different names for the first 3 books, which more clearly represented what they were. So if I talk about the books, I've got 2 titles for the first 3.
Wow.
The first book I wrote was called Prince's Gate. It's now called The Embassy Murders, and that's what it's about. It's about murders at the American Embassy, the presiding ambassador at the time being a well-known individual called Joseph P. Kennedy. And that is set in early 1940, which was the period called as the Phony War. And a lot of what was going on politically was that people were saying that we should come to terms with Hitler, and Churchill was not yet prime minister, and Joe Kennedy was one of many people who said that we didn't have a hope against Hitler and should just do the best deal we could. And the politics of life, I try in the stories, which are all about obviously murders and criminal activity, but I try to set them against the proper background of the time. And sometimes real characters feature. Sometimes it's obviously the principal stuff about murder is fictional characters. My second book, which was set at the time of the Battle of Britain, later in 1940, was called Stalin's Gold, and it was about some gold that Stalin lost, which turned up in Britain. But the publishers have changed that title with my agreement to In the Shadows of the Blitz. And that story, as I say, I found some factual evidence of gold in Spain at the time. They were before the war. Obviously, they had the Civil War, and at one point, the left-wing parties had control of the government, and that meant they had control of the treasury, and that meant they had control of Spanish gold, which was obviously very substantial. And Stalin, who supported the Spanish left-wing parties, wanted his ounce of flesh, and he got them to transfer quite a lot of the gold to Russia. In fact, I found a reference to some gold having gone missing, and I based my whole story on what happened to that gold and how did it go missing. And it had quite a bit to do with Poland and Polish Air Force pilots in England, and I'll leave it at that. It's quite a complex story. Most of my stories are quite complicated, and I usually have 2 or 3 plots running through. My third book was called Merlin at War, and it's now called The French Spy, and it's about a French spy operating amongst de Gaulle's Free French in London. And that book is set in 1941. It was nominated for Crime Writers Award over here. Didn't win, but it's nice to get a nomination, and was very well received. I hope I'm not going too quickly here. Am I running through these books?
No, you're fine.
Okay. So my fourth book is called A Death in Mayfair, and it's about murders at a fictional film studio, which I created. Much of my plots and the stories come from my research, and I'm researching a specific period. In the case of A Death in Mayfair, it's actually December 1942, which is when Pearl Harbor happened and America came into the war. But London had 16 or 17 film studios during the war, which I discovered in my research, and I thought that was quite a lot. So that gave me the idea of having something set against the backlot of a film studio. That brings us to the latest book, Dead in the Water, which is set in the summer of 1942. As I say, I get many of my ideas from my research, but also general reading. So I read a biography about a gentleman called Calouste Gulbenkian, who not many people have heard of now, but at the time in 1942, he was probably richer even than Rockefeller, because he'd been the man who had introduced all the oil companies into the Middle East in the beginning of the 20th century, and he took his 5% cut out of that. He ended up in Lisbon during the war, and of course there is a legacy there in the sense that there's a huge art collection or museum in his name in Lisbon. He was a great collector of art, and this set me in the direction of a subject which has had a lot of publicity in recent years, which is the theft of art from Jewish families and Jewish businessmen before the war by the Nazis. And so one of my plot lines in Dead in the Water is about some art which was taken from a Jewish family in Vienna before the war, and which turns up in London. And Gulbenkian is one of many people who wants to try and buy it, and sends people from Lisbon to try and negotiate a purchase. Another thing that I learned during my research, of course, by now, in mid-1942, the Americans are in the war, or as we would say in Britain, the Yanks are over here. And what was interesting to me is one facet of that was the color problems that existed in America at the time were imported inevitably into when the army came over here. And there were lots of situations in which white and black soldiers would end up fighting and so on. And there was a lot of prejudice against the black soldiers. And so another element of my plot in Dead in the Water is about injustice to a particular black airman who's in London. So I've got that, and I've got some spying going on, and I mix it all up, and somehow or other I get a result. I should say here, I'm one of those people, I do not plan my books in detail in advance. I start writing, and I usually have some ideas. So in the case of Dead in the Water, I had the ideas about Gulbenkian and the art and the black prejudice and so on. I threw that all into the mix and ended up, usually it's about 2/3 of the way through the book, I have to work out who did what. But people seem to think that people seem to like the book and that I did it okay. I should say something about my sixth book, which is the one I'm currently working on. I'm about 80,000 words in. That is set in 1943, in the spring of 1943. And I have, amongst the things that I have going on there, I have a surgeon who's killed. I have some interesting Indian politics which came to bear, and an interesting insight into the gay scene in wartime London.
Interesting. Yeah, it's amazing that because there's so many, you do have several different stories and plots running throughout the novel, and there's so many different threads that I want to tug at. But one thing that we don't always remember is that, and one thing that comes into play in the story is that when the Americans got involved in the war, they wanted to have their own court systems for the military who were over there. Sure. And I've read about it before, but it's still kind of flabbergasting that they insist on it.
I omitted to mention that. That's quite an important strand in terms of what happened. And I was completely unaware, I have to say, when I was doing my research of that particular period, I came across a reference to the change of law in August of 1942, in which what you just described happened. All jurisdiction of criminal matters alleged against American soldiers was nothing to do anymore with the British police, but had to be dealt with by the American military police system. And in my particular instance in this book, the black airman is accused of something and he's being investigated by Frank Merlin. Then all of a sudden, the case gets taken away from him and is in the hands of the American system, which causes him quite a lot of frustration. And I won't say any more about where it goes to, but yes, it is. And it's amazing how many people I've met in Britain who were completely unaware of this.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just one of those pieces of history that if you're unaware of it, it doesn't come up a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And obviously there was then friction between the American authorities and the British authorities, inevitably.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Can you talk a little bit more about Frank as the main character of the series? What about him do you think will resonate with readers?
Well, first of all, I have to say that Frank Merlin is not a recovering drunk or doesn't really have any major psychological problems running through. And again, some of my readers have commented how pleasant it is to have a detective who hasn't got any major problems and is quite likable and could be followed in that way and is pursuing personal happiness as well as job happiness. So I guess there are a lot of detectives who, and I can think of several who have drinking problems and whatever. He's not one of those. He's a true hero. He believes in good against bad, good against evil. He has good friends. He does enjoy a drink. He's not a drunk, but he does enjoy a drink. And he is looking for love, which is something we all do. So in other words, he's a good-looking, ordinary sort of heroic type character without that many. He has some flaws, but not many. And he has some quirks. He's very into poetry. He reads lots of poetry. And he has friends with whom he has poetry debating sessions in the pub. And he's extremely hardworking but fundamentally a happy man.
Let's go ahead and take our second break of this episode, but keep in mind what Mark just said, that Frank is fundamentally a happy man. We were just talking about Frank. We're going to talk a little bit more about Frank when we come back. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and my interview with author Mark Ellis. Before the break, we were talking about Frank Merlin as the main character of this series. What about him might resonate with readers? And I told you to remember that he had just said that Frank as a character is fundamentally a happy man. And so we're picking up right after that comment. And not afraid to fold laundry, I was very... I know that's random, but there's a part, I don't want to give too much away about his personal life, but there's a scene where he just starts doing housework at the beginning of the book. And I was like, you go, Frank.
Yeah, I guess that would have been pretty unusual then, but there were people like that, I'm sure.
Yes. But you don't often get to see that in books set during this time period. So nicely done.
Thank you. So I often get asked who would play him in a film or TV or whatever. And I get stuck in the sense that I can only see people of that vintage playing him. Mm-hmm. I think of Tyrone Power or Ray Milland or someone like that. But of course, there are people. Of course, there are people now who I'm sure could do a really good job if that ever happened.
Oh, that'd be hard, though. Yeah, I can definitely see some of the actors from that time period, though.
Yeah. Cary Grant is good, but I think Cary Grant is probably just a bit too good looking. He's good looking, but he's not Cary Grant. But there we are.
Yeah. you've mentioned research and that a lot of your ideas come from your research. So obviously you like research. Is that something that you research and then kind of wait for the ideas to hit, or what order does that go for you?
Yes, I do a lot of research, and research, generally speaking, during the research period, I get my ideas. For Dead in the Water, I had, in the summer holiday before I started research, I had read this book about Gulbenkian I mentioned earlier, and I had an idea that somehow or other Gulbenkian would feature in the story. But then when I got down to the real hard tax of research, I came across the idea, the stuff about the American authorities having control of the proceedings after August. And I read more about the art being stolen from places like Vienna before the Jewish families in Vienna before the war. So I had like 3 or 4 ideas bubbling in my head, and then I just start. Then when I've got those ideas, after the 3 months, I stop. And in my research involves more than just going on the internet to know what was happening. I mean, I read biographies, I read diaries, I watch films set in the period. I read books written in the period, and all of that melds together, and I start. And usually I'm bubbling with ideas to start, so that writing the first half of the book just sort of seems to come quite naturally. I mean, as I say, I don't do all the plotting in advance, but I just go where the characters take me. And the second of the half of the book tends to be a little bit more difficult, which is when I tie up all the plot, take the plots to their natural point where they need to be resolved.
Have you ever found yourself in a bit of a sticky situation where it's taken you a little longer to resolve that plot point? No, which I find astonishing, and not yet. Maybe it will happen to me. As I said, I'm about halfway through the current book, and I have vague ideas about how everything gets resolved. So I'm not feeling too pressurized at the moment. I think I'm going to be able to work out this one. And then, of course, there'll be another one. And maybe at one point I'll get a block, but hitherto not. That's amazing. How about characters? Do you also kind of let them develop on their own as you're writing?
Yes. Obviously, we've talked a bit about Frank Merlin, but Frank Merlin has a team. He has a sergeant. He's got a fluid team of 3 or 4 people around him, including a female detective, which was not common in those days, but was not completely uncommon. I mean, there were people in women detectives. And they all have developed in certain ways, and I bring in their personal lives. They have their various ups and downs. But yes, I tend to see where they go, and they usually develop strange habits and to make them more individual.
Do they ever surprise you completely? Like you've created this character and now it's suddenly more of a major character than you expected, or they go in a different direction than you expected?
Yes. Well, in one of the books, I introduce an American detective called Goldberg, who is sent on secondment to Scotland Yard. And I think if I'm correct, I had him in the 3rd book. And I thought that was it, but I'm bringing him back now. So, yes, I can get to like characters, and therefore I like to read. I've got a chap who's senior in MI5, who's a friend of Frank Merlin's, who reappears more often than not. Originally, I thought he was a one-off. So the answer to your question is yes. I mean, people do take off in different directions, and I quite enjoy that. And you can read. I'm sure many of your interviewees will have said that often the characters determine what happens in the books.
Yeah, absolutely. So you started at the beginning of the war. We're now in 1942. You said you're going to take Frank through the war. So you have an arc in mind. Do you have a number of books in mind for that arc, or is that still in process?
Not really. I mean, as I say, I'm doing the 6th book, which is set in May-June of 1943. If I were to follow roughly the same program where each book is set 6 to 9 months apart, then I take it to the end of the war in 1945. Well, that could be 3 or 4 more books. perfectly possible as to what I'll do.
Okay. And you mentioned, liking historical fiction, thinking about writing, when you were talking about when you wanted to write. What do you think about writing in specific historical eras draws you to writing within the historical fiction genre?
I just think I like particular periods. I've always been very keen on history. When I was in school, I was very strong on ancient history. We have something called A levels here. I can't remember what you call it in America, but when you're in your senior year, you're going to university. We have these A levels. They call them something different now here, but in my time, and I did Latin, Greek, and ancient history. So I love that period, and maybe one day I'll write something set then. Similarly, when I was studying history in school, we spent a lot of time on Napoleon and Pitt and George III and that particular period, and I love that period too. And I had ideas actually for a character a little bit earlier than that, in the sense that the late 17th, early 18th century, who would be based on Daniel Defoe, who was not only about the first ever novelist, but also was a government spy and a pamphleteer, very interesting character. And I still have that at the back of my mind. I might want to launch off on that. And I also would quite like to, if I take Merlin all the way through the war, I'm still interested in the post-war period, 40s and 50s. I'm not saying I'll carry Merlin necessarily into that period, but I might have another storyline I can come up with set in the 40s and 50s.
All right. And then you mentioned the character who is based on a real person that is living in Lisbon during the war. And
yes,
that's fascinating to me because now I'm living in Portugal, but Portugal was neutral during the war, but because of its neutrality, I have learned that there was a lot going on here in terms of like spies and all sorts of crazy stuff. Did you get kind of sucked into a rabbit hole of research there?
I did. Funnily enough, my first idea for the book was Gulbenkian, and Gulbenkian had been he'd come from the Turkish Empire. I think he was I'm trying to remember now. I can't remember. He was Armenian. He was born and brought up in Turkey, but then he came to England. He had a wealthy family there. He was educated, and then somehow or other he got involved into the oil business and made a fortune. And he lived in England up until the late 30s. And he, like many rich men, he thought he wasn't getting a good enough tax deal. So he decided to move to Paris. And unfortunately, then the Germans rolled into Paris. He was okay because he'd secured diplomatic immunity as a representative of the Iranian Shah, although he wasn't Iranian. And this meant that he could go to Vichy, where the French supposedly independent government set up once the Nazis had taken over northern France. And he lived there for a period. But then the Iranian Shah got overthrown and his diplomatic credentials had gone. So he had to look to go somewhere else. He actually wanted to go to America, but he had some tax disputes in America and he couldn't go there. So he picked Lisbon. And as you say, Lisbon was a hotbed as a neutral country of spies. And you could, as I have a scene in the early part of the book where everyone's in the casino in Lisbon. And obviously you can have Germans mixing with Americans, mixing with British. And that was one of the few places in the world where that could happen. So when I had the idea originally, I thought Lisbon in a way would play a bigger part than it ultimately did. Although it features as the home of Gulbenkian, who himself features quite heavily in the story.
Mm-hmm.
One of the few things that people don't know, I find, is that there was a regular scheduled air service between Lisbon and London, which, under agreement with the Germans, would not get attacked because they reckoned it was useful to recognize Lisbon's neutrality and allow such things to go on. Although something went wrong somewhere during the war because the famous English actor Leslie Howard, who featured, and you may recall, I think he was Ashley in Gone with the Wind. I can't remember which character actually, but he was in Gone with the Wind. And he was on one of these flights, and it did get shot down by the Nazis. But that was the only mistake that ever happened.
Yeah, I did not know that. So when I read that part in the book, I thought that's fascinating, because you just don't think of a lot of commercial air traffic at all during that time.
Yes, indeed.
But it had to happen. It is time for our final break of the podcast. When we come back, Mark will be talking about writing for publication, his advice for aspiring authors, etc. So stay tuned. You're listening to the GSMC Book Review Podcast, and I will be right back. Pets bring such joy to our lives, and the GSMC Pets Podcast is here to share in that joy. We'll tell stories of pets finding their forever homes, acting in unexpected ways, being helpful, or just being silly. Whether you love dogs, cats, llamas, reptiles, fish, or you've never met an animal you didn't like, the GSMC Pets Podcast is for you. Welcome back to the GSMC Book Review Podcast and the conclusion of my interview with author Mark Ellis. You mentioned, coming to writing later in life. Can you talk a little bit about that last push that made you decide, you know what, now's the time I'm going to try to write for publication?
Well, as I said, I sold the business I'd set up with my partner, and I had a bit of, I wanted to take a break, because obviously setting up, establishing a company and then developing it takes a lot out of you. And I just thought, I came across in my library, I had a copy of a thin exercise book in which I'd written really my one and only literary effort to date, which was a story for a school competition. And it was all about the Spanish Main and pirates, and it was called Spanish Gold. And I looked at that and I thought, and I read it, and it wasn't, in my own particular view, that bad. And I thought, well, maybe I can do something. And I did have an English teacher in school who at one point had said to me in a strong Welsh accent, "You have a marvellous turn of phrase, Mark. Maybe you'll make a writer one day." So with that limited amount of support in my background, I just started writing. And of course, I didn't know what I was doing. I had several drafts, and then I found an agent who was interested in it, and he gave me confidence. And eventually I went through the routes that many people do of rejection and eventual success in getting the books published.
That's amazing, though, because that teacher that teacher might not have remembered ever saying that. And yet it's stuck with you. He does, actually, because he's still alive. He's about 88, and I went to an old school function there this time last year, and I was asked to give a speech because it was in honor of him. And I told that story then, which he's not sure if he remembers it, though. That's great. From your experience, do you have any advice for aspiring authors?
Well, you've got to be thick-skinned and persistent. You will be. There's not a writer on earth, I think, maybe there are one or two sort of freaks who have been successful from the outset, but generally speaking, most writers have gone through lots of rejection at various stages, told that they're wasting their time, told that their work is not worth publishing, etc., etc. And if you really, really believe in yourself, you've got to persist and stick at it and ignore all those things. Now, I say that, obviously there may be some people who are not good writers who are told that, and they probably shouldn't persist. But if you're a good writer and you believe in your ability, stick at it, and eventually something may happen. I was speaking to quite a well-known author the other day who was saying that she'd written 20 books. I mean, she had got them published, but there were not much attention was paid before something got picked up for television, and then all of a sudden she became a famous and successful author. But in fact, 20 books took about, at least 20 years.
Right. Wow. You just never know.
Indeed.
How about reading? Obviously, you read a lot for research, but when you take time to read for you, for your own interests, what do you like? Historical fiction? What genres and authors do you tend to go to?
I do read quite a lot of historical fiction. But also I like modern stuff. My favorite, two of my favorite crime writers are Californians, Robert Grace, and I don't think Michael Connelly isn't Californian, he's from somewhere else, but his character is set in California. So I read Robert Grace's latest the other day, and I read Michael Connelly's. But I've just finished reading a very intriguing book. It's a debut novel about the death of Charles Dickens, and that was really very entertaining. But I do jump around quite a bit. I go back to the classics. I'm also reading at the moment Pickwick Papers. I read some Middlemarch last year, which I've been meaning to read all my life. And of course I read factual books, not just factual books to do with what I'm writing. So I've read recently books about George III and that period of history. But I'm very, I've got a wide range. My favorite authors include people like Patricia Highsmith, John Buchan, John le Carré. I could go Agatha Christie. Where I live in London, we're actually about 50 yards away from a house in which she once lived, where she wrote supposedly Death on the Nile. So my writing studio is within that sort of period from her house, and when I'm struggling to get somewhere, I try and wave over some inspiration from that direction.
I was just thinking you might have a little bit of inspiration from that.
Yes, yeah, I hope. Agatha, give me a help, please.
Exactly, yeah. How about the internet website? Any social media people can find on, if you can share those?
Yes, my website is Mark Ellis, like all one word, lowercase, markellisauthor.com. I'm on social media. I'm probably most active on Twitter. I'm at Mark Ellis, capital M. I'm not quite sure if these capitals matter anymore, but at Mark Ellis 15. I'm also on Instagram, MarkL1, and I've got two presences on Facebook, a personal page in my own name and a Mark Ellis author page. I think that's about it. But as I say, I probably put most stuff about books on Twitter and Facebook.
Okay, thank you. Well, we've talked about a few different things during our time together, but is there anything that we haven't covered that you want to make sure you highlight?
Yes, I think I'd like to mention that recently I've written my first Frank Merlin short stories. One of them is for a collection, a history magazine called Aspects of History, put together a collection of World War II stories. And that was my first ever Frank Merlin story. This was done about 4 or 5 months ago. And that collection is called Action This Day. And I've also written recently a short story, which has only just come out, a series has come out, which is in aid of polio. And there's a string of British writers, amongst whom is Lee Child, who, of course, is in fact a British writer. So it's good to be in that mix of company. That one's called The Unnecessary Assassin. And all of these are available, as are all my books, on Amazon and in good bookstores and so on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for taking the time out of your day, out of your weekend to talk to me. I really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Sarah. It's been a delight.
Thank you once again to Mark for joining me to talk about Dead in the Water and the DCI Frank Merlin series as a whole. As a reminder, there are 5 books currently out, so if you are interested, and then those short stories as well. So you've got a lot of books to immerse yourself in, especially if you're a fan of World War II era historical fiction or crime fiction, then this is something that you might want to check out. Or if you have someone a reader in your life who is interested in this era or this particular genre, these genres, then definitely go check out Mark's books and give them a shot. because, as always, 5 books in a series to read all at once is never a bad thing. I hope that you will join me for my next episode. We're going back to the world of thrillers. This time, the main character is a young female assassin. The book is The Child Riddler, and the author is Angela Greenman. So join me for that conversation. As always, if you are a fan of this podcast and you have not done so already, make sure you like, subscribe, follow on the platform that you listen to the podcast on. In that way, you'll always get the episodes when they come out. You'll be notified that there's a new episode. And a review is always lovely. If you have the time and the inclination to leave a review, that is wonderful. I am very appreciative of that. I thank you in advance if you do so. It helps me to get this podcast out to more listeners, such as your lovely selves. And finally, you can follow the podcast on social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. Hit me up. Tell me what you're reading. Tell me what you want to read. Tell me about your TBR. Is it getting any shorter? Do you add 5 books for every one that you read? How is that working out for you? I love to hear from you, so come find the podcast on social media. In the meantime, I hope your week is going really, really well, whether or not you have dust or sand from the Sahara in your life. I hope your week is wonderful, and as always, I hope that your week involves plenty of time for you to go out and get yourself lost in a variety of good books. Thank you so much. Talk to you next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Book Review Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.